I'm delighted to be joined today in the studio by Wade Allison, an Emeritus Professor of Physics and Fellow of Keble College, Oxford. Professor Allison has a long and impressive education spanning from Cambridge, where he studied natural sciences, physics and maths, to Minnesota and Oxford, where he read particle physics and returned to teach in this field. He's an expert in radiation safety and nuclear and medical physics. Professor Allison has written multiple books, including Radiation and Reason, which addresses what he sees as misconceptions about radiation and nuclear energy. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Wade Allison, for joining us here in the GBNews studio. I think it's the first time we've had a nuclear physicist in the studio. This is a television first. Great to have you with us. Your basic view is that we have to take care with nuclear energy, but we don't need to fear nuclear energy. We can harness it, and it can go a long way towards solving our energy crisis.
Oh, yes. And, I mean, the days were, when I was younger, when there was a choice between fossil fuels and nuclear energy, and some countries chose fossil energy, and other countries, like France, chose nuclear energy. But that choice is not open anymore. We've decided that fossil fuels are not acceptable. Of course, we could go back to before the Industrial Revolution, at which point we gave up the things we now call renewables because they weren't reliable enough.
So France uses about 70% of the electricity France uses is generated by nuclear. Here in the UK, it's about 15% most years. This is weird, isn't it? Because back in the 60s, which I remember, and I'm sure you do, we in the UK were producing more domestic nuclear energy than the whole of the rest of the world put together. Now our nuclear plants, such as they are, many of them are old. They're going to be decommissioned soon. We've got 7 or 8 or 9 or so operational, and most of them are run by EDF, which is owned by the French government. How did we get into this situation where we seem to have lost our domestic nuclear capability and expertise?
Well, I think our politicians and most of the population have lost confidence, and we've got an educational problem. People need to understand that nuclear, it's amazing. It's amazing how safe it is. People talk about the disaster at Fukushima.
This was in Japan in 2011, yes, after the tsunami.
But nobody died from the radiation.
Thousands died, but from the tsunami.
Oh, yes. Yeah. That's very dangerous.
Yeah.
And I've been out there 4 times and talked to the people and the survivors, schoolmasters, and local authority people who have contact with people.
So when you appeared on the show a few weeks ago, we were, in the run-up to COP, we were discussing whether a nuclear energy could be part of the solution or a bigger part of the solution for the UK, helping wean us off fossil fuels. And you made the statement, no one's ever died from nuclear radiation. And I wanted to really unpack that statement and explore it with you more. How can you say that?
No, nobody's died of nuclear waste. Of course, they did die from the fire and blast at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and an extra 1% of them died from cancer and so on that was probably induced by... Of course, most of those people have died anyway now, so their medical records are all available, and 100,000 medical records. We've got a fantastic data set. People were frightened that there was going to be a genetic heritage to their children, but medically we found that none of that happens.
And people died in Chernobyl in 1986, of course, the biggest civilian nuclear disaster of all time, and yet that wasn't from nuclear waste, as you say, that was from a reactor melting down, which is a very different thing.
Well, I mean, there were 28 of them died from the radiation, the people who were brave enough to go in there and do something about it, and from helicopters and so on. And then there are statistically probably 15 children who died from thyroid cancer, although that's contested by some people. But that's about the level. And as far as we know, there is no scientific case can be made that anybody else died. Of course, you can make exciting videos about it, which people like to watch, murder stories and ghost stories and things on television. But that doesn't mean to say that they're true.
And you would know, as one of the world's leading theoretical physicists, why have we got into the situation, Professor Allison, where we are so scared of nuclear? Is it because we associate domestic nuclear power with nuclear bombs, with the obviously the loss of life at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the atomic bombs dropped in the aftermath, as World War II was ending? Is it because we associate it with belligerence? You've written that nuclear phobia is a costly aberration that the world cannot afford. Where did this phobia come from?
Well, it came in the 1950s. We had the Cold War. And one of the weapons in the Cold War was to make not only the other side frightened of your weapons, but also, unfortunately, your own side gets frightened of nuclear weapons. And, of course, this has happened with bows and arrows and so on in history, that part of the objective with weapons is to make people frightened. It's a much cheaper way than actually killing them. So this was, fortunately, very successful, although we won the Cold War. But we're left now with a legacy that people don't understand, and people are being taught by schoolmasters and their parents and so on that there's something frightening about nuclear. And it's amazing how safe it is. As I say, nobody died at Fukushima at all, and even the numbers at Chernobyl were only 40 or 50 altogether. Not a very big accident.
And what would you say to those who would suggest that another reason we've tended to undermine nuclear, certainly in the 70s and into the 80s, that the trade unions in the coal industry were very, very powerful. They didn't want nuclear to come to the fore, or they didn't want it to stay at the fore as it had been in the 60s, because they wanted to retain jobs for their workers. Is that also an issue?
Oh, it's an enormous issue. And the whole of the oil industry, not just the workers, but the owners of the fossil fuel resources and the workers. And then now we have a situation where there's a whole industry, safety industry. Nothing sells like safety. There's a safety industry of protecting people from nuclear radiation. And it's a multi-billion-pound industry. But it shouldn't be there.
We don't hear conversations like this very often on television, do we?
I don't get a chance to say it very often.
Or the radio. How are you... And yet, no one can possibly challenge your authority to speak on this issue, given your astonishing academic credentials. How is this opinion viewed across the academic world, across the scientific community? Is anything that you're saying scientifically controversial? It might be politically and civically controversial. Is it scientifically controversial?
I think the answer to that is no. I'm a founder member of a group on the internet called SARI, Scientists for Professional Scientists for Research for Radiation Information, and we've got people in New Zealand and Australia and all sorts of people who don't have an axe to grind, except that they're worried for the future of the world and their children and their grandchildren.
And you're saying a combination of fear, a hangover from the Cold War, a combination of existing vested interests, not least the fossil fuel industry, plus lazy journalism is the reason why we're not treating nuclear as seriously as we should be when it comes to tackling climate change.
Well, there's another thing, that after the Second World War and in the Cold War, people were, when they're frightened, that nuclear is above your academic pay grade.
Yeah.
We didn't learn about that at school.
Yeah.
I have to take what other people tell me.
Yeah.
It's not very difficult. It's no more difficult than fire, and it's a damn sight safer. So we need to get it back into schools. We need children to be asking about them. And we did not have, that's another matter, we were not allowed a very effective voice at COP.
You mean the nuclear expertise groups like yours, academics?
You were barred
from COP?
Yes.
How does that make you feel? You're one of the world's leading experts on atomic physics. How does that make you feel? You've clearly got a huge amount to contribute.
My principal concern was to make sure that the young people who are dedicating their lives, have studied nuclear and have decided that this is their way to go. They were doing dances in the street and things like that. They were expressing themselves about the importance of nuclear.
Are you now sensing, you're in a very academic environment. Oxford is a hotbed of, politics and opinion and sort of fashionable social mores and so on. Are you getting any sense, Professor Allison, that the environmental case for nuclear, and I know from my own reading, that's why you're here on the show, there is a strong environmental case for nuclear. Are you getting any sense that that is breaking through into the mainstream of the environmental movement now?
Not enough. Everybody, except young students and people like me, are looking at the possibility of employment and a job. Now, there are no grants, there are no fellowships for showing that things are wrong, and that what you need is for medics to understand more about nuclear physics and nuclear physicists to understand more about medicine. That doesn't produce money. So there's a communication problem. Education is terribly segmented into little pressure groups.
Little silos.
That's right. Now, I was lucky enough, about 25 years ago, in Oxford, there was a proposal to expand physics into a fourth year, and I started giving a course on applications of nuclear physics. Well, it turned into medical physics and imaging and all these fantastic things that you can do with the radiation, and that was very, very popular. But that got me into talking a lot more with doctors and sending the students up to the physics students up to the local hospitals and to see what physics, and in particular nuclear physics and radiation, could do for people's health.
Isn't it astonishing how averse we still remain to nuclear power when across the Channel, our great rival, the French, we always compare ourselves to the French, and yet they're generating 70% of their electricity from nuclear power and running all of our operational nuclear power stations?
Well, I think that's a 30-year-old picture, in the sense that they have been closing nuclear power stations because the Germans didn't like it. And they are on the edge of, and with difficulty, proposing to build nuclear power stations themselves in France. And in some senses, where with Hinkley Point and so on, we're ahead of them and working with them, because these things are all international. I mean, obviously there are problems of collaborating with China, but I think we should be working with Japan and South Korea and other places who've got a lot to contribute.
Well, Professor Allison, here on The Money, we're certainly going to remain open-minded. We're going to keep discussing these things, and we thank you for your work and your expertise and for coming on the show today. Professor Wade Allison of Oxford University. Pleasure to have you here, sir.